Welcome to a special edition of We Aren't Dead Yet. Today, courtesy of River Street Writing, we are interviewing author and D&D enthusiast Peter Darbyshire of the recently re-released The Mona Lisa Sacrifice, Book 1 of the Book of Cross trilogy.
Welcome to another episode of We Aren't Dead Yet. I'm Emily Armstrong, creator of the TTRPG system Quests and Quarrels, as well as the settings Becketville, Culinary Punk, and Elder Space.
Hello, I am Dazen Cat. I am the creator of the TTRPG Meaty Bones, as well as the worlds of Pangorio and Hypnosium.
Hi there, my name is Sapha Burnell. I'm a best-selling cyberpunk and mythpunk author and an editor for a small press, and I'm going to remind everybody today there's always something we can do, because we aren't dead yet.
Peter Darbyshire is a former journalist and the author of 6 books and more stories than he can remember. He lives near Vancouver, British Columbia, where he spends his time writing, raising children, and playing D&D with other writers. Hi, Peter. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think D&D enthusiast may actually come first. Especially these days. My writing group has turned into a D&D group. We spend more time playing D&D than writing.
I love that.
So I'm the author of the books The Mona Lisa Sacrifice that you mentioned, The Dead Hamlets, which is the second book in the Cross series, and The Apocalypse Arc, which is the third book. Also, the author of the short story collection Has the World Ended Yet with Will Second Win? That came out in 2017. I think I was naive in that title. I think the world maybe has ended and we're sort of catching up on it. And then the author of The Warhol Gang and Please, my sort of 2 previous books. And like you said, I'm a writer, lives in the Vancouver area, also a communications professional in my day job.
Nice. So, what's your favorite, North or West Vancouver?
Oh, man. Well, I could never afford to live in West Vancouver, but I did live in North Vancouver for a time. I'm at the Fraser Valley right now, but I absolutely loved North Vancouver. Just that living up in the mountains. I would bike everywhere I went, and I was in constant good shape just from riding up those hills and
all the hills up Lynn Valley. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just being able to hike in the woods. Like, I'm an outdoors person, so I absolutely love North Vancouver, and I miss it dearly. But this just gone through the atmospheric river, and all my friends were basically trapped in their homes because of all the flooding and stuff. So I wasn't particularly missing it when that was happening, because it does get the very extreme weather events.
Yeah, I was watching the feed from actually the Lynn Valley Canyon of all the water just gushing through and over the highway there. And I was like, oh, I used to drive that all the time.
Yes, yeah.
Because Vancouver girl. Yeah, so yeah, North Van for life. Love North Van, although I do love going to Ambleside. So Ambleside is a lovely, lovely park. Very good view. And speaking of views, we've got plenty of those in The Mona Lisa Sacrifice. Daz, take it away with about this novel.
The first novel in the Cross series follows the reluctant hero Cross across time as he battles renegade angels trying to start a new holy war on Earth, hunts down a deadly ghost that is haunting Hamlet Productions, and assembles a crew of Atlanteans, pirates, vampires, and the damned to stop Noah from ending the world. It's a wild romp through history and literary culture, with a cast of characters that includes a band of very mischievous fairy, literary characters such as Alice from the Wonderland Tales, and a modern-day Frankenstein's creature, an enigmatic Christopher Marlowe, Gorgons, and much more. Darbyshire delights in mashing pop culture genres together, exposing profound truths beneath classic tropes in ways at once hilarious, weird, and heartbreaking. Publishers Weekly. One of Canada's finest literary writers, CBC's All Points West.
For thousands of years, Cross has wandered the earth, a mortal soul trapped in the undying body left behind by Christ. He's been a thief, a con man, a soldier, and a drunkard. He's fought as a slave in the Colosseum and as a knight at King Arthur's side. But now he must play the part of reluctant hero as an angel comes to him for help finding the Mona Lisa, the real Mona Lisa that inspired the painting. Cross Quest takes him into a secret world within our own, populated by characters just as strange and wondrous as he is, gorgons and dead gods hidden away in museums, fairies that live in countryside pubs, trapping and enslaving unwary travelers, and super rich collectors who trade magical artifacts among themselves. He's haunted by memories of Penelope, the only woman he truly loved, and he wants to avenge her death at the hands of his ancient enemy, Judas, a forgotten god from an ancient time. The angel promises to deliver Judas to Cross, but nothing is ever what it seems when Judas is involved. And when a group of renegade angels looking for a new holy war show up, things truly go to hell.
What do you want readers to feel at the end of the Mona Lisa sacrifice? What message do you want the readers to take with them?
I don't know if it's a message. The Cross books, so the Mona Lisa Sacrifice is the first in the series of the three that are written so far. And then I've got a new novel coming out next year and a short story collection at some point, hopefully. And they're kind of my love letter to literature. You know, I grew up just reading so much. And literary characters have been the sort of constant in my life. I think they were my best friends, essentially, when I was younger. And, you know, those characters that stay with me. And I wanted to write books that actually bring them to life in the way that they kind of had that presence in my life. Obviously, I can't make them all real in my life, but I could make them real in the work of fiction. I wanted it to be, you know, a work of fantasy, but a work of I guess we'd call that urban fantasy. I call them supernatural thrillers, whatever you want. That is our world. So I didn't want it to be a secondary world fantasy. I wanted it to be our world, and I wanted all those characters, you know, Alice from Alice in Wonderland and Frankenstein's creature and whatever other characters, to be real, to have that same sort of presence as everyone else in our life. Characters from myth, the angels, all that. So if people walk away from those books with that feeling that those characters are real to them, then I think I've succeeded.
With that, I'm interested because I too write contemporary fantasy. I write urban fantasy with my Judge of Mystic Saga. And when you're dealing with characters like Princess Diana and things in the book, how do you rectify what people view of this person who existed in the world and, you know, the people's princess, a very beloved figure in history, with creating a fantasy about them? So it's almost like, you know, it's the costume of Princess Diana instead of Princess Diana herself. What was sacred and what wasn't about representing these characters?
Yeah, the Princess Diana thing is interesting. And so for people who haven't read the book, there's Cross is an immortal who's got sort of magical powers. And one of them is he can raise the dead. And at one point, he actually raises Princess Diana because they need some information from her. And she's the only person that can kind of provide it. You know, I had a little fun with that one, and I wasn't.
She's a little sassy.
Yeah, I wasn't too concerned with historical accuracy, and partially because with a historical character like that, you know, all you're ever going to get is their kind of carefully cultivated representation. Anyways, you're not going to get like the real person behind the scenes. So there's a lot of points in the book where I actually did a lot of historical research. So like the Mona Lisa Sacrifice, there's a part of it that's set in the Great Depression, and I researched the hell out of that. I read all sorts of books on the Great Depression, and because I really wanted to make sure I was able to sort of plant enough details that it felt real for people. I didn't do the same sort of research with Princess Diana. I was sort of relying upon a certain reader participation in constructing that character and sort of bringing their own experiences to it. The royal family and celebrities like that are often such polarizing figures that we kind of bring our own mythology, if you will, to them. And so I was sort of counting on readers. We're just doing a bit of that. And it's also not like a huge scene in the book. So if that doesn't work for people, like it's basically one chapter, right? Rather than the character that's present throughout the whole book. So I was willing to sort of gamble on that one a bit.
I guess it was interesting just from my perspective, because I know people who knew her.
Oh,
you know,
really?
Yeah. So it was like, oh, got to that part of the book was like, whoa, okay. First thing though, I was like, oh, he's not an Althorpe. What's he gonna do? And then you solved that problem. I was like, okay, he's not breaking into Althorpe. This is great. For those of you who don't know, Althorpe is the seat of House Spencer and also the place where Princess Diana, may she be forever at peace, it was belovingly interned. on a small island in her family estate that she loves so much. If you had to describe the Mona Lisa sacrifice in just 3 words, what would those words be?
Unhinged literary magic. It's been called unhinged in reviews, which is probably my favorite review ever.
I guess that leads to a question further on of, do you read your reviews?
I used to read them more. I try not to these days. It's hard, if you get a review in the Globe and Mail or, the Vancouver Sun or CBC, like it's hard not to read that, of course, right? When I was starting out, I would read, the Amazon reviews and Goodreads reviews and things like that. And I've sort of stopped doing that for the most part, just because they're largely positive, but they'll often sort of put things in my head about the books that I don't necessarily want to be there, or somebody's like wishing it was written this way, and it kind of gets into your head as a writer. It's another voice that's in there, and there's already enough voices in my head as a writer, as I'm sure you guys probably feel the same. You don't want to get that sort of undue influence on your creative act from somebody else's opinion. So it's nice to get like the big positive reviews and that kind of publicity that comes from it, because it's just important for getting word out about your books and that sort of thing. But yeah, I try not to read them too much these days. And I also find like the whole publicity and marketing landscape around publishing and books has changed so much that a lot of it isn't reviews anymore. It was really interesting to me that while I was still doing the proofs, copy editing the proofs for these books, I kept seeing them popping up on TikTok videos and Instagram reels, and people were being like, "Oh, I just received this book from the publisher," and I was like, "Oh my god, like I'm not even done this book yet." But it sort of highlighted to me like, oh, like the landscape is really, really different now. And when I started writing, my first book was published in 2002, I think, please. And back then it was all the newspaper reviews, right? And a bit of TV and radio and that kind of stuff. And that was the extent of it. And then, blogging came along and Goodreads, sort of grew and things like that. But now, yeah, it's so video based. And that's a different kind of way of talking about a book. It's often not a review, right? It's more of it's almost like a lifestyle kind of thing, right? Like people will show how that book is incorporated in their life rather than kind of reviewing it.
Absolutely. Book talk, as they call it, is huge right now. Yeah. I think it feels like every 5 years there's a major overhaul in marketing.
I just remember the days when the Canadian newspapers were just chock full, every single one, with inches and inches and inches of reviews. The Globe and Mail had an entire review section that was quite substantial. And it's interesting to see the sort of dwindling down of that, the inches lost as things kind of clammed up a bit. It's been something that's been both trepidatious, but also very exciting, because you're like, oh, what am I going to do? And then it's like, wait a minute, there's this entirely new thing. If I get some book talker to dance about my book, then, that's going to do better than any review for the Globe and Mail.
When I was in school, TikTok and that kind of stuff wasn't really even covered. It wasn't part of it. And that was 2018. That wasn't that long ago.
Speaking of changing quickly.
Yes, let's extreme change. Who was your favorite character to write?
I'd have to go with Cross. He's the immortal, the soul who's born into the body of Christ after the ascension. You have to, Christ shuffles off his mortal coil to destination unknown. And Cross winds up in his body with all of his powers, but he's the exact opposite, right? He's a total rogue, a thief, a killer, a drunk, and he just doesn't want to get involved in saving the world, but he always gets involved in saving the world against his better sort of intentions. So he's just a very interesting character to write because of that creative tension in putting him in that body that has all of these, all this mythology around Christ, and then making him that opposite character and sort of having to try and find that middle ground where he actually does do good things, but not for sort of like the typical reasons. He's often doing good things to try and protect his friends, more than anything else. He's a very interesting character for me to write, and he's a very fun character to write because I realized at one point, I was like, oh, geez, he's like immortal. Like I can basically set things whenever I want. And so wherever my mood sort of takes me. So when I wrote the short story collection, and I deliberately tried to do like a story in every kind of different time setting. So I did like a Prohibition cross story and a Wild West cross story and a, Beowulf and Grendel myth cross story and, and so on. And so that was like a lot of fun to be able to have that kind of freedom with the character. He's also quite challenging to write because when you have a character that essentially can't die, like, it changes the stakes of the story you're telling. So I had to make the stakes sort of bigger than his own life and death. And so it's often, the apocalypse arc, it's the state of the world, or the Mona Lisa sacrifices. He's largely, it's a plot about revenge, him trying to get revenge on Judas who wronged him. And the dead Hamlets, he's trying to save the life of his daughter, Amelia, from this ghost. So it's often having to make the stakes about something beyond himself to make it compelling, because he is sort of a challenging character to write. So he's probably my favorite, but I'm pretty fond of Alice too. I created this adapted Alice from the Alice in Wonderland tales in the book, and equally challenging to write because you want to make sure you get that sort of character right. Like, it's such a well-known character, but I also tried to sort of embed the kind of madness of Wonderland within her as a character. So rather than the sort of Alice we know as the character who's, more or less like us and goes and explores Wonderland, but I wanted to have this Alice kind of embody that kind of whimsy and madness of Wonderland. And so she was a lot of fun to write.
I did have a question about that. I had a question about whether or not you played America McGee's Alice.
No, I didn't.
Oh, really? Okay. So America's McGee's Alice is Alice. It's your Alice.
Oh, really?
Sapha brought up that it reminded her of American McGee. I was like, I loved American McGee's Alice, and I was like, man, I think that you would really enjoy this game. It was a lot of fun. It's an earlier game. I think it probably came out around 2000, if I had to guess. But it's a fun, gritty Alice in Wonderland take.
Tis a gothic Alice in Wonderland, where she is rescued from a mental hospital in the Victorian age, brought back to Wonderland, and uses the Vorpal blade to create bloody havoc. Yeah, so it is very, gory and goth and dark, while still having some bits of whimsy. But, there's a line in the Mona Lisa Sacrifice about Alice with a book, and the question about what sort of leather was used to create that book. I will let you read the Mona Lisa Sacrifice yourself. But yeah, I did have a question about whether or not you'd played America McGee's Alice or anything like that, or any of the sort of goth Alices that we got, especially in the early 2000s. Because it was, that, between that, and I was wondering too, whether or not delirium from The Endless ended up coming into your mind at all when you were writing Alice.
Oh, interesting. No. In fact, the character of Alice that was sort of inspired by an illustration I saw, like 20 years ago or something. It was a drawing, this really dark, moody drawing of Alice wearing like a top hat and sort of embodying the rabbit. Like, she's got whiskers and these sort of menacing looking rabbit teeth, and she's holding a bloody axe behind her back. And if I can find it, I'll send it to you or post it on my channels. But it was just such a different rendering of Alice, and sort of menacing, but also magical, that it always stuck in my head. And so when I started writing this character, like, that was kind of the thing that popped into my head. And I was like, that's kind of what I want to embody with Alice. So yeah, a bit of magical menace.
Now, what inspired you? We've talked a little bit about this already, about what inspired you to write the Mona Lisa Sacrifice. What inspired you to write the setting and sort of getting into the character of Mona Lisa herself?
Oh, it was a multi-stage process, because the book came to me with the character of Cross first. And that came from a poem called Dream of the Rood, an old English poem. Yeah, I studied it when I was at the University of Western Ontario. And it's a poem that tells the crucifixion from the point of view of the cross. And it talks about what a great responsibility it is to, bear this important figure of Christ. And it was just like such an interesting perspective to me that sometime later I started thinking about Christ and the crucifixion and what had happened to to the actual cross. And then I just started thinking, oh, like, what if the body is sort of the equivalent of that, the thing that bore him in this realm, but then his soul left and left the body behind, just like, the cross was sort of left behind. Then, okay, well, now we've got this empty body. What happens if the soul pops into it? And so that's how I got the idea for the character. But then I didn't know what to do with the character. I was like, oh, this is a really interesting character, right? This rogue soul in this holy body. And I started thinking about Gaudi's church in Barcelona. It's just weird, magical, insane place. I've visited once while it was still under construction. It's like one of my favorite places in the world because, it's an incredibly holy place, but it's so completely alien to our sort of typical cathedrals and churches and that sort of thing. And I just loved that kind of weirdness about it. And then I was like, I need to start the book at this church. The book needs to be weird because that's just the vibe I was getting. And then it was just sort of the different things just started falling into place. I knew, okay, well, there's going to be angels in this book because of just the nature of what it was, but I didn't want it to be just angels or, angels and devils and things like that. Like once I had that kind of magic element, magic realism, whatever you want to call it, I knew I wanted those characters from other books in there, the literary characters, like I said, like Alice just basically came in and wouldn't leave the book. And once I had her, then I knew I could bring in however many others. And the settings, I just really wanted it to be our world because that was really, really key to me, that it had to be our world for the sort of magic of the book to work. Everybody had to look at it and go, yes, like I can see this happening in my world, and maybe it's happening, and just like the angels haven't made themselves known to me, and because they're all very kind of secretive at the same time all this is happening, like they're running around our world, but they're trying not to advertise it too much. So I just like that possibility of transforming our world and making it into this magical place that's populated with these magical characters.
Yeah. And I do have to say, as a confirmed Christian myself and somebody married to somebody within the Orthodox Christian Church, it does very, very much help that there are other mythologies in the Book of the Cross series there, because once you add in other mythologies and other sorts of ways of looking at the world, then it's like your brain can actually fictionalize something that, you go to church, twice a week, learning about and being steeped in. So I do have to say that it was really fun for me to see the Gorgons and to see the fairy and to see, all of these other figures in mythological history. And it just helped kind of sandpaper some edges on something that for some people, like I'll shout out to my more Orthodox people out there. This is a work of fiction. It's not making any commentary on religion itself, although it is a work of fiction using things that some people hold sacred. And I think the biggest one would probably be Princess Diana. No, just kidding. Sorry, I had to shout that. My priest listens to this, so I had to shout something.
No, it's funny because the Princess Diana one is the one that I was always sort of most concerned about. The premise, like I'm sort of aware that, there's probably going to be some people who are just going to be outraged at the idea of it. And that I hope that if they want to read it, that they can get past that, because it's not like an anti-religious book. And I was very careful, to try and write it that way. It's interesting. I got asked in an interview recently what my spirituality was, and it's a tough one to answer because I'm not really in any kind of official faith, but I do consider myself a spiritual person, and I sometimes go to the Unitarian Church in Vancouver, and and I do readings, books, and theology. It's if I had to sort of take a position, I would probably sort of be in parallel with Nick Cave and the way he's talking about spirituality and religion these days, where there's a real impulse that's there for a lot of people, I think, including myself, for spirituality, and a sort of struggle with the kind of traditional forms. And I think Cross kind of embodies that, so that he's, obviously there's an uneasy relationship between him and the church and angels and the sort of traditional trappings of religion. But at the same time, he's often living the values, even though he is, like I said, like a drunk, a thief, and a killer and all that kind of stuff. He often transcends that, and sort of the more the books go on, the more he actually transcends that, and the more he starts doing things that are a sacrifice of himself, particularly like in the new book that's coming out, and basically making sacrifices for the greater good. So I think there are a lot of those sort of values present in the book. They're just kind of re-encoded.
I love that. One of the things on our podcast is we have very different experiences and beliefs, and we like to talk behind the scenes in our group chats and stuff constantly. And I think that kind of stuff is fascinating, talking about where your different experiences and spirituality come from and how you kind of digest them as you grow older and experience them as an adult, you know? A bit of a spin on a question. Do you have any unusual or like maybe unexpected sources of inspiration that you've taken either from your spiritual journey or the reading that you've done in your past or any media you enjoy?
Some of Cross's personality, it would be what some people would probably call stoic, right? Like I've read a lot of stoicism, or I should say I've read a lot of sort of modern interpretations of stoicism. Pretty bad about not going to the original source material and reading what
it's hard sometimes.
yeah, but I've read like tons of Ryan Holiday and listened to podcasts, and he's kind of the modern day stoic guy. And Oliver Berkman's 4,000 Weeks he sort of wrote a book about we have 4,000 weeks in our life, sort of a time frame, and it's best to use them well, right? And how you spend your time is who you are, especially at the end of your time. And so I've been reading a lot of those over the past like decade or so. I've always had struggles with anxiety and have a tendency to catastrophize and I'm a parent of children with health issues, so I had a lot of anxiety about that.
Of course.
And yeah. I mean, it's just normal parenting anxiety. And there's like, the health issues on top of that. I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly how it kind of got into these books, but I think it did. And I think Cross in particular embodies a lot of those sort of stoic principles or tenets or, whatever you want to call them. And then there was a poet, Christian Wyman, who wrote a book called My Bright Abyss, Meditations of an Unbeliever or something. I can't remember the exact title. He's an incredibly gifted American poet who was raised religious and then moved away from it and I think became an atheist and then got a terminal cancer diagnosis and sort of moved back into his faith, but moved back into it from a position that wasn't, naive, all-accepting position raised in, but was sort of an interrogation of the faith and trying to find his way into spirituality, into like what he actually calls the bright abyss, the sort of gap between reality and what we know to be true and that leap of faith, right? And that abyss in between the two, right? He sort of has this whole thing like that's where God actually dwells. And it was such a radically new way of looking at religion for me and looking at spirituality and looking at that kind of impulse and that quest to try and figure out what is real for you, if nobody else, right? Like what your path is. Again, like it was sort of transformative for me because it put that moment of spirituality in that unknown rather than trying to find some known to prove it or disprove it or whatever, and sort of made religion a verb, spirituality verb more than a noun. And so that was quite important for me at a tough time in my life. I know that's crept into these books somehow, but I would probably have a hard time pinning it down because it's not something that's consciously me going, okay, I'm going to write my bright abyss into these, into the story, but it's more that kind of relationship with the spiritual and the faith and the unknown that is sort of present and I think in the background of these books.
I hadn't heard of those before, so I'm going to have to look into that because that's a really fascinating concept of that, spirituality being in that kind of blind spot, essentially.
And it's such a beautiful book because he's such a gifted poet. So, part of the magic of that book is simply line by line for me.
Very cool. And actually, speaking of maybe books that other people haven't heard of, do you have any other additional books that maybe people aren't aware of and you think that they should be aware of and taking inspiration from or just checking out because they're fun?
If I had to recommend one book, it's always going to be Invisible Cities by Calvino. To me, it's just one of the most creative, wondrous acts of the imagination ever. Don't even really want to say anything about it because it's just, the joy of it is discovering what it is. It's a book of tales of imaginary cities. And I'll just leave it at that because it's pure magic.
I love those kind of books where you can't explain too much because it'll ruin the entire experience for you. I love getting to experience those for the first time. I know kind of one of the meme books right now on TikTok and everything is House of Leaves. It's the big, everybody's got to check it out, but nobody can say what it's really about. And it's another one I also recommend because it's a haunted house book, but I guess almost the book itself is haunted and it feels like it haunts you. And it's something you just can't. I love books like that you can't really describe. You just have to recommend.
Those are the best.
All right. So we've gone through your favorite kind of underappreciated books, like what we're going to go on there. Let's start talking. I know something that Daz has been waiting for with bated breath. Let's start talking some D&D, because this is We Aren't Dead Yet, and we talk books, we also talk literature, philosophy, but we also talk a lot of gaming.
Yeah. So, the big question, player, dungeon master, or both?
Oh, I will play however I can. These days, I'm a dungeon master, and it's almost accidental, though. You know, I've been playing in a few different campaigns, and I hadn't played for a very long time because I just moved away from everybody I played with, and so there was a period of gosh, probably like 15 years or even more where I didn't play. And then I was just like, oh, I need to get back into this. And so I started playing again, and it was kind of like online games for the most part, a bit in person, but most of the people I knew who played were playing online. And I just kept getting into situations where the DMs would kind of quit halfway through the campaign. They didn't like the way the campaign was going, or they had, scheduling conflicts or whatever it was. And so that was super frustrating because I was, invested in these characters and invested in these campaigns and invested in the social kind of connections. And then it would just, go away through no fault of my own. Or maybe it was. Maybe they just didn't like playing with me. Just, canceled the campaign.
That's the typical fate of digital play.
I was going to say, I hear this constantly. I feel like most people have experienced, especially online games, a lot of them I've found unfortunately tend to fizzle out, and it's awful.
Yeah.
It feels like a true loss every single time.
It does, yeah, because it's this thing you invest in and you make these connections, and then it all just, then it's just gone one day. And so I was like, I wanted to keep playing, and I just thought like, I'm gonna have to dungeon master, because like if you're running the game, then you'll be able to play like in that capacity, right? And I knew like I would see things through to the end, anyways. I'm not gonna quit halfway through or whatever. So my writing group that I mentioned earlier, we were sort of talking about, as the restrictions were being lifted in the pandemic, we were starting to get back together in person. We started off, I think, just playing board games, and then we were like, why don't we play D&D? And I was like, sure, I'll DM it. And I hadn't DM'd probably since I was like a teenager. So like the last time I DM'd was like AD&D, right? Like forget like numbered editions, right? So I picked up 5th edition books, and it was such a different game. And so I sort of went to my friends. I was like, look, we're going to sort of go back to the basics, because I'm going to have to learn how to DM, and I don't want to have to learn how to DM and learn how to, the virtual tabletop kind of stuff. So let's go like total old school and just keep it in our imagination, right? And like, we'll have some crude maps and things like that. But we also made a real effort to meet in person. We typically, if we can't all make it in person, we tend to reschedule, and like those who can make it in person will have like a board game night, and then we'll save the D&D for the next time we can all meet as a group. It saved our souls during the pandemic, and it's such an important part of our friendship and connection, and so we're just sort of winding down the campaign now. But the funny thing was, I took Candlekeep Mysteries. I don't know if you know that one. And
yes, very much.
So collection of book themed adventures, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I was like, this is perfect for a bunch of writers. And I kind of turned it into a campaign, right? So it took, about 3/4 of them, and kind of adapted them and made it into like the story I created. But I don't know what your experiences are, but trying to DM a bunch of writers is an interesting process, because, you get lots of notes, and you get lots of, well, your storyline is interesting, but I think we're going to take it this way.
I can only imagine that if I played an entire D&D campaign, that's what would happen. It's so out of the three of us, I'm not somebody that has done a lot of TTRPG content ever. I've had 2 attempts. one of which was horrendous, and the other of which was a one-shot where I ended up hugging a plastic tree.
Real life hugging a plastic tree.
Real life. It is on my Twitch channel forever. It was a live event. Poor Katoy our GM, you know, we were playing an indie TTRPG called Navathem's End, but I've never played a D&D campaign. I'm the odd person out when it comes to that. So I can only imagine that as an author myself, I would be like, I see what kind of leads you're trying to shove me, and I tell you, I'm not going into the forest. Let's go start a bar. You know?
The group that I've played with is primarily voice actors, so we get a lot of critique on our character voices, no matter how silly they are. But I'm really the only writer in that group, and so I'll pick up on tropes, and I just realized that that's got to be a nightmare for GMs. I cannot imagine how difficult it must be to try to throw a twist in when they know what all the twists that are generally used are. That's
it's like playing chess with somebody who actually plays chess and not somebody who's like, which way does the horsey move?
It's a matter of giving them the feeling that they're getting what they want, but they're not. And so that always feels fresh. It feels new. They feel satisfied that they did this, and they get surprises out of it, fulfilling for their character and how they're portraying their characters. And yet it's still a story they're all managing to tell together, each with their own little spin to the same story. It's like taking a plot for each person involved at the table and weaving it into one story, even though it seems impossible. But that goes back to the AD&D days. When you get those modules, there'd be random modules you could buy by stacks of them. And the original campaigns where you just grab a module, oh, we're in this character level, boom, we're going to run it. And then the trick is now you have to link it to another module you want to play. And so that became your campaign, was instead of having a big ultimate goal, the big ultimate goal should be, well, let's get everybody to level 20. And then you just weave a story by weaving all the randomness together and somehow loosely fits up to what big boss at the end does. If you run a loose campaign, it's so much easier because you can bend and twist and juke and jive with whatever's coming at you as the dungeon master and still make it all woven together for everybody at once. You're like the spider in the middle of a web.
I try and take the real sort of collaborative approach. Like, to me, the adventures are largely driven by what my players have done in those previous adventures. So, you know, you can put them on a rail and drive them through the adventure that you've got and try and make them, you know, stick to that. But that's actually not that interesting. And I find the sort of crazy things they do are actually inspiring. I try not to plan too far ahead because I know whatever plans I have, they're going to derail, right? So I'm sort of thinking like one adventure ahead. And often I'll take some weird thing they've done and just turn that into like the big twist or the next big storyline. It's this, you know, wonderful, weird, magical story that we've all written together, rather than me sort of trying to force them into some story I've written or I've bought or whatever it is. And so, like, that's the kind of the wonder of it, is we've created this really, really fun and interesting tale together that just would not exist without that particular group of people in those particular combinations and settings. So yeah, it's the collaborative storytelling is the way I like to think of it.
Yeah, I agree. That's my favorite part about TTRPGs and playing games together like that in general, is the collaborative storytelling and honestly the ridiculousness that can just occur from a certain group of people getting together and trying to tell a story.
Absolutely.
You could set up the perfect plot and you could think everything's going to go so smooth, and the players will end up 100 miles away on a different continent doing something completely different.
Oh, one of my players was obsessed with, she had a saddle of the Cavalier, which is a saddle that, like, you know, you put it on a creature and you can't get thrown off. And she was obsessed with trying to ride everything.
I would absolutely do the same.
And there was a wonderful moment where she actually succeeded in riding a beholder. And wonderful moment that we had in this campaign that, you know.
Onward, Blinky!
I love the idea of trying to figure out where a saddle goes on a boat.
I think at that point you just jump from above.
She did. She jumped from a balcony onto the beholder.
It has not only does it have the center eye, it has the 10 eye stalks, and somehow it didn't notice this thing jumping on its head.
Oh yeah, they were getting torn up, and then she did that. Yeah.
Yeah, 10 tentacle eyes is not enough sometimes. I'm just saying.
But then what did she do with it?
Well, they were able to. It was crazy because it was supposed to be the sort of mini boss fight, right? And
yeah, of course.
that then unlocked the portal to the next area and all that kind of stuff. And they ended up actually managing to charm this beholder. And so then I had to do okay, well, let's reconvene next week.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, they had a beholder buddy for a short time. It was actually sort of a dream beholder. It was sort of mini pocket dimensions that they were going through this Lich's realm, and the beholder was the servant, and so they were able to sort of charm it. But then they realized it was a dream version, and then they went through a portal and into the Lich's lair where they encountered the actual beholder. So which was an undead beholder. So they got into this crazy fight where they were making the death tyrant fight its own dream version of itself, which was now on side with them. It was pretty surreal.
Yeah, the things you hear from D&D campaigns sound like surrealist dreams, and you're like, no, it's just the thoughts that happen with this group of players. I love those stories.
It happened. I mean, there is nothing more wild than any TTRP adventure. You get a group of people together playing an imaginary game. Shit is going to happen. That is the most beloved part of it all. And it doesn't matter what happens. It's all good. It's so embracing. It's so encompassing. And it's almost like pulling everybody together like a band of brothers or soldiers in a war. You've been through the blood, sweat, and tears together. And you came out the other side. And then not only are your characters bonded, but you as players and the Dungeon Master, you're all bonded.
Yeah, and I should mention too that player was actually a local writer. It's Chrissy Cherish, who wrote the Owl series of books. And so it was Chrissy Cherish and Sebastian Castell, who writes the Great Coats series, was the sort of tank at that time, and he was getting mauled by the beholder. But yeah, it was interesting to see how also their writing styles, because Christy's got a wonderful that act that her character did was the exact sort of act that Owl from her Owl and books would do as well, right? So she's kind of an Indiana Jane character, right? A relic hunter. So it was interesting to see those kind of moments too, where you can see their writing coming through into the D&D world as well.
How does your D&D gaming influence your writing? Do you ever do that classic, I don't know what to do, roll the dice, I'll figure it out?
No, I don't do that, but I do. I think I have a very collaborative writing style in that I drop story threads into books that I don't follow. And so my hope is that the readers kind of follow them and create their own kind of stories in the universe that I've set up. I like the idea of just letting the reader's imagination sort of go wild and run amok with this idea that I've planted, but let them create their own adventure with it. So kind of like how I DM, I don't try and railroad the reader through on sort of one specific line. I mean, obviously the books aren't quite like a sandbox kind of world, but there's lots of kind of parallel stories or story prompts or whatever you want to call them that are out there for their imagination, and that they can kind of take that route in their own mind.
The little Easter eggs.
And they can always lead to potential spin-offs later.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. Well, you've got a universe which is almost infinite for stories. So, you could tell alternate history. You can do so much with this kind of cross universe that you've got going on. So it's always so great to see that kind of thing, because you can never run out. There's always something what happens if he trips and falls into a bog and then all of a sudden meets somebody. So kudos to you for being able to have something with legs,
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel very blessed to have the idea. Yeah.
And finally, do you have any questions or comments that you've always wanted to be asked about your work, but have never had the chance to be asked or to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I would love if somebody asked me, can I give you life-changing money to make this into a movie? I've never been asked that yet, and keep waiting.
Cough, cough, hint, hint, nudge, nudge world. We're putting feelers out.
All right. So if anybody's looking for another streaming series or a series of movies, I do believe that you could read the work of Peter Darbyshire. Talk directly to him. I think that would be a lot of fun because there's a really good mix of sort of action and being able to do a very fun, non-linear sort of thing. And with a character like Cross, I mean, as we've just seen with Deadpool and Wolverine, rated R material where you have immortal superheroes that, every single attack that Wolverine and Deadpool give each other when they fight themselves is fatal to somebody, except for them, it's just flesh wounds. You have swords sticking out of Wolverine and Deadpool yanking them out and things like that, and then going back at it. So as we've seen, that kind of thing, it made more money than Barbie. Okay, Deadpool and Wolverine with the best cameo ever from Channing Tatum. Thank you very much for bringing Gambit into the world properly. That thing made more money than Barbie. It made over $1 billion. So clearly, something like Book of the Cross, something like having the character of Cross would do quite well.
I don't even need $1 billion. I'd settle for, half that.
You heard him, Netflix. It's a deal.
Settle for Godzilla -1 money, and you could still make something freaking amazing. So let's see this done. We want to be in the credits. This was possible because we told people to do it. That's it. Don't even name us. Just say we told people to do it. Just kidding. All in good fun. But, clearly this would be very cinematically wonderful. And I think you'd have a lot of fun with it. So shout out to the ether, to the universe, to the people with money looking for the next big thing. I think you found it. You've definitely found something that will both accost people with certain sensibilities and at the same time use that rebellious sensation to really bring people into an epic story of revenge, betrayal, and a little bit of love thrown in. I think that sums up The Mona Lisa Sacrifice by Peter Darbyshire. You have been such a fantastic guest. Thank you so much for coming on here today.
Thank you guys. This has been so much fun.
Just as we're finishing up, is there 30 seconds that you want to take to shout out to all the aspiring authors out there, all the aspiring creators, the people who want to develop their cross, who want to develop their book? What advice do you have for creators out there that may need a pick-me-up or you got this, champ?
Yeah, just write. Keep writing. Write every day if you can, although, I'm not one of those people who's like, you have to write every day, but write. And just always remember that, your voice matters and that you are the one person who can put something unique into the world that would not exist if it weren't for you, and the world needs more of you.
Love it. Absolutely love it. And if you want to get into D&D, just be prepared. Somebody might try and put a saddle on a beholder, but that's okay.
Stick along for the ride.
Stick along for the ride. Yeehaw! And with that, another special thanks to Holly of River Street Writing for setting up this interview. That is riverstreetwriting.com. Please consider following We Aren't Dead Yet on social media at Blade and Banter. If you would like to be interviewed or know an author who would, contact Emily on VredaMedia.ca. Please consider supporting We Aren't Dead Yet by becoming one of our Not Dead Knights or Lasting Legends on Substack, or buying one of our many books and TTRPGs. I hope you have a fantastically wonderful day. And Peter, we're going to be sending you off also with a complimentary copy of Cutthroat, Grueling Jail, which is a TTRPG minigame created by our one and only Dazzlecat. So we hope you have a fantastic day, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
Oh, thank you all. Wonderful.
And with that, all you rebels, writers, and gamers, we're wrapping up another mind-bending episode of We Aren't Dead Yet, your go-to for all things TTRPG and speclet. Stay wild, curious, and keep defying the ordinary. Until next time, hit up WADY at VredaMedia.ca/WADY. That's VRAEYDAMEDIA.ca/WADY. like and subscribe, share with your friends, check out our merch store. We'll see you next week for more news, views, and hullabaloos. So keep the fires burning, the dice rolling, and the pages turning. And remember, there's always something we can do, because we aren't dead yet.